my local patch is getting much bigger than probably our plus. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the species that I've found, species that I'm looking for still. And if you've got any questions, just shout out, please interrupt, but we can do some little questions at the end. So I'll crack on. So I don't know if anybody, ants of Britain and Ireland, so are native and well established. Anybody any idea how many species are classed as natives or well established in Britain and Ireland?
43? It's either 26 or 43 or something, I don't know.
Yeah, very close. There's about 60 plus species. And that's mainly ones that are classed either as native or well established, but not ones that can only live inside. But within that, we've got 60 species, but Europe as a whole has about 400 species. So you can see we've got small, quite little amount compared to the rest of Europe. But that's because of we're islands and don't swim very well, and also probably our climate as well. So this is a list. I think this is about 58 species. I've excluded a couple of Channel Islands only species in subfamilies, but you'll see some of the usual suspects: Niger, flappers. A couple of, some of the myrmicas are very well established species, quite wide. And also we've got 4 what we can class as true wood ants, some of them are familiar probably with some of those species. Right, so I thought my local patch, I guess, is the most obvious place to start, really my garden. So a couple of pictures of my garden. And I thought, I've got a couple of species, flappers, Niger, a couple of myrmica species, and I thought I'd just mention Niger, because they're the ones we see in our garden, ones we're familiar with, probably one of the most widespread native species. So what I've done, I picked Niger because every year they have a mating flight. And they come out of my window, out of the corner of my window, with a seed. I don't want to seed it up, so I leave it. Every year they have mating flights and they come out. I think this was last year. And we're probably all familiar with Lassius niger flying. You get on the press, you always get invasion of flying ant flying day and all that kind of thing. And ant flying day is normally not a day. It's very, well, I don't think it's ever a day. It's normally spread over weeks, even sometimes a couple of months, depending on the weather. But occasionally you do get in certain areas, if the weather's perfect, you do get large flights. And we have females, winged females, some people call them princesses, but I guess the more scientific name is guy. So that guy means potentially a female that could become a queen. So if she mated, removed her wings and started a colony, she'd become a guy. And also then you get the little males that you see flying, they mate in the air. I noticed a lot of people are starting to call male ants drones, but that's really, I think, honeybees that really want them. But I just call them males. But every year, I love going out and seeing my Lassius niger flying up out my window. I'm not sure where they're nesting, they're probably nesting out. So I thought I'd start off with a garden and probably one of the most common ants. Now, I don't know if you've heard Andrew's talk about the temporary social parasites. They're fascinating species. And Andrew was talking about Lassius umbratus. Now, I think this was a couple of years ago. I went out into my garden, there was a mating flight going on. I get very excited when the mating flight goes on. And on my patio was a Lassius umbratus, and she had grabbed the Lassius niger worker. She was sort of munching on it, chewing on it, and running around the patio where there was sort of Lassius niger nest. And as Andrew explained, we think she probably does this, kills workers to get the odour from that colony so she can infiltrate. But I won't go on too much about the band. Great talk on this. So that's this arbortus in my garden. So, you know, worth looking out. I've seen them running in parks in cities, that kind of thing. Worth keeping an eye on. Pembury Country Park is a kind of a coastal area, just down near Philadelphia from here. And I was there one day with friends, and I found this species, Sabularum, and that's another temporary social parasitic species. Probably not so well known. Few records. It's probably quite common, but we need to get more data on that. But I found it there just running after me. So they would again infiltrate a host species. I think they probably don't. They do different species in the area, but they're fascinating species, I think, and really interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to move to another coastal area, Pembrokeshire Coastal National Park, which isn't far away from us, and also near Swansea, Gower Peninsula, which is a very busy area sometimes, but a fascinating area. And I came across the Formica cunicularia. It's kind of a large Formica ant, kind of ant. But when you look at it closely, it's got a lot of red in it. But this ant, I went to St David's down in Pembrokeshire, and there's a little church called St Non's, a lovely church, it's right on the edge of the coast. And I wandered around the area, and I found loads of Formica cunicularia on there. They were on umbrella for plants, probably hunting insects and aphids, but also I think they were actually taking nectar from the plants, and possibly pollinating them as well. They were nesting under this footpath. It was just like a little footpath in the ground, and they were nesting under there. And sometimes they make mounds, but when you walk along the coastal paths, you'll often see this species running across the path. They like it warm. But quite an interesting species. You can always identify it. It has red in the thorax. Sometimes the thorax is really red. But this one's not so red, and they normally have a little bit of red on their cheeks as well, so you can kind of tell the species. Now moving on to Formica rufa. I visited places not far from me, not far from here actually really, Breckford Forest. And as far as I'm aware, what I've done searching for some old records, probably one of the only places where Formica rufa is found in Carmarthenshire. It seems to have died out everywhere else. And this large mound was on a trail which I visited a couple of weeks ago, and I couldn't get there. There's devastation in the forest, winter storms, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, when I went and looked for some mounds where I knew they were, there'd been a lot of forestry work, and at least one mound was destroyed, and the others had been damaged. So I think Breckford and in South Wales, wood ants are really struggling. You'll know that, won't you? That they really are struggling, I think, in South Wales. But in spring they'll mass, and what they do is they take the heat of the sun in, and then when they go back into the nest later on in the day, they actually generate heat within the mound. So a great species. I was invited last year to talk as well, and I talked about this ant, Picea, the black bog ant. I've done it in length then. But here, about 10 minutes away, is Korsgård National Nature Reserve. It's a wet, damp heath, and this ant, Formica Picea, is quite unique in Britain because it's found in wet, cold habitats. It likes boggy areas. And that might be an advantage for the ant because ants generally don't like living in that kind of habitat. It could be a dominant ant in this kind of stagnant bogs, that kind of thing. It's a rare ant. It's only found in Dorset, South Wales, New Forest, and I think a couple of sites in Surrey. So a really rare ant. And I volunteer for the Wildlife Trust. It's an excuse to go out looking for ants, isn't it? Perfect. And what we do is we survey for the little mounds. They build little mounds out of vegetation, 20 centimetres high, probably at maximum. And they build them in the kind of boggy situations. And they build them to catch the sun, which speeds up their brood development. But a really interesting ant, maybe under-recorded, because not a lot of people really fancy wading through bogs to look for them. So they certainly may well be under-recorded. But fascinating ant, a bit like Formica fusca, but very, very shiny. And if you see a really shiny ant in a bog and it builds these kind of little nests, then more than likely this species. So going Gower Peninsula again, Gower and Pembrokeshire is just brilliant for ants. And Tetralorium spastica, small ants, look kind of black in the field, but it looks quite browny. I went to Gower, a place near Norton called Norton on the Gower Peninsula, and I found several nests of this ant, kind of at the base, under stones, that kind of thing. And it makes really populous nests, 20, 30,000 plus ants in a nest. Problem again, easily overlooked. Quite well distributed. It's a coastal ant, heathland ant. So Dorset, Hampshire, it can become the dominant ant on heathland. And also it can survive heathland fires as well. It goes down deep. And sometimes after heathland, they actually benefit from burnt areas because they like the sun to penetrate the vegetation. It's quite an interesting ant. And I went ant hunting with Andrew on Friday. We were looking for the ant, and we found loads of nests near Amroth, along the coast of Cardigan. And one thing which is fascinating with these ants is this is a guy or a winged queen pupa, and you can see the size of them compared. The queens, I've got a little colony at home, and the queens are huge, and the workers look tiny. And they were trying to drag these to safety, and 2 or 3 or 4 of them had to drag it back because they're so big. So an interesting and easily overlooked, but worth looking out for. A Gower again. Long here, but I was up on the top of the sort of cliffs here, and Temnothorax albertennis. Now the Temnothorax, I think we all know them as kind of acorn ants, because they're found in acorns, found in plants, that kind of thing. So these were nests, I found 2 nests of these, and they were nested in little gaps between the rocks going in. So really hard to see and find really. But a small little ant, makes small little colonies, easily overlooked again, but quite an interesting little ant. One of my favourite ants, Lasius spalaginosus, jet black ant. I've seen this quite a few, coastal areas, sand dunes, that kind of thing, always worth looking out for on them. They're an easy ant to sort of ID in the field. They're more robust than Niger, very shiny, and they have this distinct kind of cut out head. And as somebody mentioned yesterday, you can smell them. They've got a sort of an odd kind of smell.
They smell like coconut.
Coconut, yeah? And you can really, so if you find them and smell them, you can almost ID them from their smell. Strange kind of smell. You can see the distinct heart-shaped head on it. And they form trails, so they form really distinct trails, a bit like wood ants. And you can see them. And I found a colony, I was looking for wood ants in Brecon Forest, and I don't know, I've got eagle eyes when it comes to ants running along the ground. And I noticed this little trail, and followed them. They looked like they were going to a tree, milking aphids for honeydew. And I couldn't find the nest, it was down a kind of a sheer drop off a path, and I think my wife did one day trying to encourage me to go down there, but I was a bit worried at that. But I didn't find the nest, but they normally nest in hollow trees, in sand dunes sometimes, logs, that kind of thing. But a really fascinating little ant. And what's interesting about these is they are a temporary parasitic species, but they're known as hyperparasitic species because the queens of this species invade the nest of another temporary parasitic species, so which is really quite specialised, and they're easy overlooked, but I think they are local in certain areas, and then you may not find them for ages. But that so you potentially could find in one nest 3 different species. So you've got the hyperparasitic species, the temporary parasitic species, and then your host species of the original parasite. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think so. So an amazing, fascinating life cycle, I think. So going back to kind of quite a widespread ant, Leptothorax acerbum, sometimes called slender ant. I've kept a couple of colonies of these. I went to a place, Brighton Forest. I was looking for wood ants, old records, but unfortunately didn't find them. But I found quite a few colonies of these, and this one was nesting in a fallen branch of a tree. Again, very widespread, probably under-recorded, but easily overlooked. So if you go to any woodland or area like that, it's always worth it. You sometimes see the little ants. They move like little mechanical machines. Quite fascinating. And they tend to nest in drier timber than a lot of other ants as well. Small little colonies, maybe 1 or 2 queens in them. But certainly worth looking out. Right, so going back to a really common species, and a host species of many sort of temporary parasitic species. This is Geneva Park in Llandudno, which is near where I live. It's a National Trust property, 800 acres with an lovely old 17th century house. But it's got an ancient deer park, which is about 100 acres. And this habitat's probably not been ploughed or it's constantly been grazed, probably for decades, if not centuries. And on this deer park, you can see here as well, the Geneva Castle, so it's an old ruined castle as well. There's just thousands of these mounds on this grass, and you can see them here. So one day I thought, how can I count how many there are? So what I done is I got an aerial photograph online, enlarged it, and worked out how many acres. So I think about 8.5 acres area. And what I done is I enlarged, and you could almost see the mounds on the photograph because the grass was kind of looked a bit groundy kind of. And I dotted each nest. I kept counting, and in 8.5 acres of this area, I counted about 3,000 to 3,500 massive splendid mounds. So, an absolutely amazing. It's probably one of the best sites I've ever seen for massive splendid. And Andrew now, with his talk, has kind of inspired me in the spring to go out looking for mixed queens. And hopefully, there's such a good population here, hopefully I might come across them. But although Lassius flavus, I know probably few of us keep them, really common ant, probably the most common widespread ant in Britain, but it's quite an interesting species. Where it lives, it has benefits for other flora and fauna as well. So, Geneva Park has got quite a good population of green woodpeckers, and the reason for that is especially in the winter, the green woodpeckers feed on the larva and the ants of Lasius flavus. So that benefits the green woodpeckers. Also, what we think as well is some grasshoppers lay their eggs in the bare soil of the mound as well. So, and some plants as well grow on top of the mound, and it benefits a lot of plants. I went up to there was a mating flight taking place. I think it was a couple of years ago. I thought I could shoot up there, and unfortunately I missed the initial flight of all the ants, of all the lays. But there was still a load of ants flying around. When I looked at the bare soil in the field, which there's not many, there's mole hills, that kind of thing, there was just hundreds and hundreds of dilated females, so the females that had mated and taken their wings off. Just hundreds of them all together, clustered together, digging in as quick as they possibly could, probably to avoid the woodpeckers and everything else, to start up new nests. And I just couldn't believe how many there. When you think there's 3,000 more nests, the number of alates that are flying out must be incredible. And they were just digging in, and what this species often has in their nest, they have more than one queen. And probably what happens is they cluster together, lay their eggs, probably quite harmonious to start with. But possibly when the workers start hatching, the workers will then maybe cull some of the queens that aren't laying or are not dominant, and they'll cull some of the some of the queens. But it was quite amazing to see. Every year now I try and go up at the same time, but often miss the natural flight. And you can see here one of the workers, and you can see here it was bottoms up. They were all just kind of diving in, digging in. So you can see how many there were. Every bare patch of soil had hundreds of these queens digging in. Okay, so there's some of the species I found locally. The garden. You'd be surprised how many species you might have in your garden, depending where you live. There's species that you may not even think of in your garden, so it's always worth looking out for. But I always keep searching. I'm always searching. When I go out hunting for ants, I'm looking out for other species. Now this is an interesting little ant. Formicoxenus nicodemus, a shining guest ant. It only is found in wood ants, so the four true wood ants in Britain. And when I visit Brexton Forest, I always look on top of the mound surface to see if I can see these ants. They're 3-4 millimetres long. But I've been told if you go August to October, warmish day, cloudy, you might be able to see, if their population's good, you can see them mating on top of the mounds. And the males are quite unique because they don't actually have wings. They're wingless males. And they'll mate on top of the surface, and they nest within the wood ant's nest. They're xenobiotic. Xeno just means guest, really. And they live in twigs or plant stems within the mound. So the wood ants tend to ignore them. But if the wood ant goes for them, they'll just freeze. And once they go into their nest, obviously their tunnels are so small the wood ants will go through. Not sure. I don't think they really know what they eat. If they raid, I don't think they raid the wood ants, but they might benefit from some of the wood ant waste, that kind of thing. But it's always an ant I'm looking for, but I haven't found it here. But if you live in an area with lots of wood ant species, you might be lucky to see them around. Just stare for hours at the top of the mound. I'm hoping one day I might come across them. Another couple of species here. Myrmecina graminicola. Now this is often called the woodlouse ant because when stirred it kind of curls up. Quite timid ant. And I'm always looking at it. I know it's been recorded on Gower. but it's easily, again, another species, small, easily overlooked, little colonies. But this is an ant, depending where you live, but this is an ant to look out for in the garden. I think there's records of it in South London, Surrey, that kind of places, in people's gardens. I've been told to cut an orange around, just leave oranges around, and these love coming up to oranges, and then you can never identify. So, quite an interesting ant. This one, Pomera. This is another, probably quite a rare species, on its limit in Britain. It likes the warm, so it's probably on its limit in Britain. It's been recorded in Cardiff, I think, quite recently, but mainly the south of Britain along the coast, it's like hot. But it's always an ant that I'm looking out for. And, you know, every time I go out, wishful thinking that I am going to come across it. But it lives in the leaf litter. And sometimes you'd have to go through the leaf litter to kind of find it. I've got a little colony at home actually, but they're so slow and they lay a few eggs and then they hatch and their workers hatch, but I think their colonies probably aren't up more than probably 50 to 70 individuals. Quite a primitive species as well. So they're a couple of the species I'm looking at. I love recording ants. I just go out and I record. I think it's so important to record ants because if we don't know where the ants are, well, we don't know they're there. Also, we can't conserve the habitats for those ants, and we can't conserve the ants. So I think it's really important to record, even a common one. And I post mine to iRecord, which is part of the Biological Record Centre. Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society, or BWAS for short. If you're interested in the native ants, that's an absolutely amazing resource. It's got website, all the species, description, maps, that kind of thing. I'm also into my bumblebees big time, and that's a really good place for bees and wasps as well. And then a Bee Wars Facebook group, UK Bees, Wasps and Ants, which is here, part of that. That's a great as well. You can post photographs of ants on there. If they could be ID'd for photographs, they'll be ID'd on here. There's some amazing ant experts. Andrew, who's done the talk on Central Social Parasites, is one of the people on there, and I'm always bugging him for IDs on there. I really struggle with myrmica. I just find myrmica so hard to ID, looking at the antennas and that kind of thing. So I get a bit lazy and I think, that's what this is doing. So there's some great resources there, and it's so important to, I think, record all species. Right, so before I finish, I thought I'd better tell you a little bit about, as it's AntCon, a little bit about the species that I keep. I used to keep a leaf-cutting ant's nest back in early 2000s, at the Murmac's nest. I had it for about 8 or 9 years, I think. No. Absolutely brilliant. I love them. You know, if you're thinking of getting them, I'd say do research, but they are so good. But don't think you're going to be able to go on holiday or whatever. That's the only thing. But I just haven't got the space or the time really now. So I love my little natives. I've managed to get a couple of Myrmicina colonies recently. They're nice and small, live in little test tubes. Lovely. I've got the usual suspects, a couple of Niger colonies, Flatus colonies. Unfortunately, my polyginosis queen, I found a dead ant with her legs up in the air, unfortunately. So maybe I'll get another species of them. But one of my favourites is Linnaeus, the brown tree ant. And it's a species, I think, was first recorded in the late 1920s. I don't know if anybody's heard of an ant, especially called Donisthorpe. He was the sort of forerunner of the ant kings, I think. And he recorded it in the early sort of 1920s, and it seems to have spread from there westwards. And recently there was a record in a park in Cardiff. I even my wife, she was searching for massive brooms everywhere. That's quite a rare occurrence. And I managed to find them on an oak tree. They're unique in Britain in a way that they live in living trees, but they will live also in rotting tree stumps, that kind of thing. But it seems to be doing really well. They're not sure if it was originally native and overlooked or not recorded in the 1920s, or if it was introduced from maybe Europe in timber or something in the street. But it's worth looking at. I know I saw sort of article and it mentioned Windsor Great Park. It was talking about nearly every other tree has less plastic brunosa. Oak trees are worth looking at. And really interesting little species. Also, I think mention at this time really as well, we're all ant keepers, and I think what we have got to do is make sure we get our ants from reputable suppliers. I think there's been lots of press reports recently
Smuggling or something.
wildlife crimes, of people smuggling in thousands and thousands of queen ants from Africa.
Mesocephalotes.
And unfortunately, those ants, once they're discovered in the airport, those thousands of queens, I would say, are going to be destroyed. So all these, what are native in other countries, have been lost. So I think that's really important to think about where we actually get our ants from, and also, of course, releasing ants, and even some of our native species where they're not found. I think we've got to remember not to release. Okay, so finished now. I'm glad. Diolch yn fawr, thanks very much to a couple of people. First of all, Anty Matters and Ancon for inviting me back again to talk. It's always a pleasure. I love coming here. Andrew, who done the talk on the temporary parasites, and he lent me some photographs to use on here. And also, I thank him for all the hassle I give him over ID and species. And also bee wars, where I got the information from. And thank especially you for listening to me. And I just hope you enjoy the rest of the show. It's brilliant. Have fun. Thanks very much.
Thank you.